Today is March 4, 2017, and we've been studying the community rule. So let's ask our Heavenly Family to guide us in our discussion. Eloheinu, Heavenly Family, thank you for everything that you do for us. Thank you for sending your Son, Father and Mother, to come here and live as a man among men. Thank you for loving us equally with Him. And thank you, brother, for considering us valuable enough to give up your former self and to become one of us forever. Thank you so much for such a great sacrifice. Help us to really learn the lesson from it that we ought to learn. So guide us in our discussion tonight. Help us and to be cleansed. Toda, thank you. We ask this B'Shem Tzemach Hu He, in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
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 So in terms of a recap, we have been studying the community rule, which is a text that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it is a very important document. There are many important documents among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is important in its own right. The way in which this document is important is that it tells us a lot about the community of individuals who actually had the library, which has now become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. This community is identified by most historians as being some form of Essene Jews. So you have Pharisees and Sadducees and Zealots and Nazarenes, and Essenes was one of the groups of the day. And this community lasted from the first half of the 2nd century BCE up until the year 68 of the Common Era, when the Qumran community, Qumran is the place on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea where the scrolls were found and where the settlement was, and that's where this Dead Sea Scroll community lived. But in 68 is when the Romans destroyed that settlement, and it went from being Qumran to being Khirbet Qumran. Khirbet means ruins, so it's the ruins of Qumran. No one really knows what Qumran means, but that's the name for the place. And so it's, we've called the Dead Sea Scroll community the Qumran community. However, we have to understand that the community of people who believed like they did was certainly broader than just the people who lived there. That was, in a sense, maybe like a headquarters, that sort of thing. It was a center where they copied manuscripts and they studied and they had certain events and ritual baths and things like that. But not everyone lived there. There were people of like belief scattered throughout Judea, and perhaps even further than that. But the community rule is a document from the early period of that community, which describes its purpose, its self-understanding, its practices, its constitution and bylaws, as it were, its fundamental teachings. And because of that, if we want to know about the Dead Sea Scrolls, understanding the community rule is very important. Another reason why it is very important is that among the scrolls which represent the writings which originated with this community, the community rule is among those which exhibits the greatest amount of parallels with the writings of the New Testament and other writings of the early followers of Christ. In other words, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and if you focus on the writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls which originated with that community, and then you take those writings and you compare them with the writings produced by the early followers of Jesus, you'll find that some of these writings have some parallels. And you could take all the writings of the followers of Jesus as a whole and take, let's say, the community rule or the war scroll or another text that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you could say, well, how many times does the war scroll have parallels with the writings of the early followers of Jesus? And you can see, okay, well, there are so many times. Okay, well, how many times do the Hoseot, the Thanksgiving hymns, have parallels with the writings of the early followers of Jesus? Okay, well, that's a fair amount of times. And how many times does the community rule have parallels with the writings of the early followers of Jesus? And there's a fair amount. And so the Thanksgiving hymns and the community rule are among those writings with the most parallels to the writings of the early followers of Jesus. And these parallels are not on points, or I should say not just on points, which were common to all Jews. Of course, there are parallels of points that are common to all Jews, but they are parallels on points which are unique and original to the Qumran community. And within the Qumran community, these ideas and phrases were unique and original to the founder of the community, known as the teacher of righteousness. And so in studying all this, we've had to ask questions like, what did people like John the Baptist, Jesus, the disciples, Paul, and the early Nazarenes as a whole think of the teacher of righteousness? It's quite clear that he claimed to be an inspired messenger of God. And he taught that someone is either for God or against God. Someone is either working on the path of light or on the path of darkness, for the God of Israel and the angel of his truth, or the messenger of darkness and all the spirits allied with him. Those are the things that the teacher of righteousness taught. And those are the things, or those are among the things, that Jesus and his followers continued on teaching from the teachings of the teacher of righteousness. And that type of teaching is a paradigm which says that something is either for good or for evil, and thus the fact that Jesus and his followers had that paradigm shows that they would have viewed the teacher of righteousness as either being for good or for evil, either a true prophet or a false prophet. And the fact that they take this paradigm from him shows that it would really be unrealistic to think that they think that he's a false prophet and yet take the paradigm from him which would reveal him to be either a true or a false prophet. And there are more things that we could add to that. But without going too broad into all the different parallels between the Qumran community and the teachings of the teacher of righteousness with the Nazarene community and the teachings of Jesus and the apostles and so on, it's sufficient to say that the community rule is a really important document. It was important to the Qumran community. It was important to the Nazarene community to whatever extent, although I will say that they were now in a new context, and they had a need to have documents similar to the community rule, though not precisely the same. So the Didache, for instance, serves to function in much the same way for the Nazarene community as the community rule did for the Qumran community. It's not that one is rendered void because there's another one, and evidently the Nazarenes still read writings like the Thanksgiving hymns and the community rule and so on, because their usage is apparent within Nazarene writings, some more than others. But it's important to recognize that, okay, yes, context changes, there's need for additional instructions, but those additional instructions do not make null and void previous instructions. Sort of like how in the Davidian movement you have the Leviticus of Davidian Seventh-day Adventists. In the branch movement you have the branch supplement to the Leviticus of the Davidian Seventh-day Adventists. And the supplement is adding extra information and instruction that is applicable within the branch movement, though not discrediting the Leviticus, which is applicable not only in the branch movement but also in the Davidian movement. So there's another reason why the community rule is very important for us to study, and that is that its purpose and its teachings are the purpose and teachings that our Heavenly Family has given to us in these latter days. There are many significant parallels between what it has to say and what we have been learning, even independent of it, yet at the same time, there's a lot that we've been learning while studying it. And I must throw a qualifier onto all this, because so far, out of the 11 columns of the best preserved manuscript of this document, known as 1QS, we are still only in column 4. So the comments that I'm making are primarily in relation to those first 4 columns. However, there are a few sections, such as in column 8, that we have read and discussed and all of that before, and seen that the purpose given for the community in the community rule in the first 4 columns and also in column 8 are the same purpose that we have. So there's a lot here for us to study. There's questions that we have, and there are many things that we have learned from in our studies of the community rule. I'll also specify a little bit more that we have studied 2 primary sections so far that are contained in these first 4 columns. The first section is dealing with the overall purpose of the community rule and what it means to enter into the covenant of grace, what it means to join the community, and there's an annual covenant ceremony and so on. And that's kind of the first section. And then it transitions into this teaching on the 2 spirits, or the 2 ways. And that's the part that we are in now. In column 4, at the beginning of the column, it describes the manifestations of the Spirit of truth in the world, and then the consequences of walking in the Spirit of truth. Following that, this column describes the manifestations of the spirit of falsehood in the world, and then the consequences of walking in the spirit of falsehood. Now, the place that we are presently at in studying the community rule is investigating the manifestations or the ways of the spirit of falsehood in the world. And we're asking questions like, is this particular proposed manifestation of the spirit of falsehood actually a manifestation of the spirit of falsehood? In other words, it's making a claim concerning this. Is that claim correct? Is it true that greed, for example, is a manifestation of the spirit of falsehood? Well, how do we understand that? Are there any other passages that legitimately connect with this one that might inform our understanding of what this is saying even more? And is this promoting righteousness? Is it promoting good principles or bad principles? Is it something that we can verify or falsify? And we're wanting to learn everything that we can. And if we can see that, oh, well, this really is the case, that this particular aspect or characteristic is a manifestation of the spirit of falsehood, we want to know how to avoid participating in that particular characteristic. And so we want to see how truth combats the lie which lay at the root of each particular manifestation of the spirit of falsehood. And of course, this is practical instruction. That's why we want to do it. We want to expose the lies that have so thoroughly pervaded throughout this world so that we can live by the spirit of truth. So the last attribute that we have been discussing, and I think we probably have more to discuss in regard to it, is ways of lewdness in the service of uncleanness. And I saw in a text that Rachel and I sent a question relevant to this subject of ritual purity, and we will get to that in this call. And what we'll end up doing, like the way that we've been going about this, as those of you who have been on the calls know, is that in each of these studies on the community rule, in this go at it, in a sense, because we've studied it for a while and then gone to other things, and then come back, and then gone to other things again, and then come back again. And so it's kind of been an on and off study for over a year now. And what we've been doing this time around is that we'll focus on a particular aspect of the community rule, and we're going through it in order according to the copy known as 1QS. And each time at the beginning of our study, after I give a recap, we have broader questions relating to the community rule, the Dead Sea Scrolls, things just more broadly related to the community rule, though not necessarily focused in on the particular phrase or line that we are studying at the time. And then after we address some of those broader questions, we focus in more closely on the aspect that we are studying in our chronological investigation of it. So that's what we'll do this time. And the question that Rachel asked has to do with ritual purity, and that does focus a bit more on the precise element we're looking at now. So we want to make sure to get to that, but I wanted to ask if anyone else has broader questions in relation to the community rule or the community or anything like that first. And then once we focus in, again, to the particular phrase that we're looking at, the first question that we'll address is Rachel's question. So anyone?
I just got a comment, and that is their community was destroyed just a couple years before Jerusalem was destroyed. I never realized that before.
Yeah. It's this was all in the time of the Jewish revolt, which started in 66 and lasted till 73.
I have a question.
Sure.
If we do result in determining that the community rule is inspired and it is, it's a good thing to follow, do you see us following it to the exact, and that I mean specifically like the rules, the consequences, and following the exact thing, or is there or do you see us changing a few things similar more in our day? Do you know what I'm asking?
Yes, that's. I do understand your question. It's a very interesting question. It's a question which, in order to answer it adequately, requires certain qualifications, and it requires going through certain elements of the study that we haven't gone through yet. So I won't be able to really answer it as much as you'd like it to be answered, I'm sure. But I can mention a few things in relation to that. So first, the community rule has multiple copies. Those copies, as any ancient text, or as the copies of any ancient text, have differences between them. And some of those differences do occur in instances when there's something that might be referred to as the judicial section of the community rule, where it talks about what happens when people violate certain principles within the community and how those are to be penalized. And, it talks about like a duration of 30 days, for example. I mean, there are different periods for different things, but for instance, like if someone, and let me just actually give a real example here rather than just going off of memory and risking not getting it right. Okay, so 1 QS, column 7, line 5. Whoever has deliberately deceived his companion by word or by deed shall do penance for 6 months. And the way that it describes the penance earlier, and this is something that we'll have to study to see, is this exactly what the penance is for all of these, or is it just for one? But the way it describes it is that everyone receives a certain portion of food each meal or each day, and that at least for one of the things, and maybe this applies more broadly, and this is actually the first one in column 6, line 25. If one of them has lied deliberately in matters of property, he shall be excluded from the pure meal of the congregation for 1 year, and shall do penance with respect to 1/4 of his food. So having a quarter less of the food that he would normally have for his meals for a year, and not partaking of the meal with the congregation. Now, there's a lot of parallel to that idea in the writings of the Nazarenes. For example, receiving a certain amount of food each day is in Acts. It talks about how, in Acts they would receive their daily portions. I think this is in Acts 6. So that's part of it. And then Paul talks about not letting certain people eat with you if they're within the community, but they've done certain sins, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of parallel, but of course this is one of the aspects of the community rule that people object to, because people don't want to live with judicial laws. But anyone living in any government has to live with judicial laws, and this is way more mild than the Mosaic Law, but we'll have to look at this more as we get there. But here's the thing. There are certain things that if someone does something, they have 30 days of a penalty. Well, in other manuscripts, it'll have a different amount of days for the same thing. So when we're talking about following something to the letter as is written, well, what exactly do we mean? Which manuscript exactly are we talking about? Also, another thing, if we're going to follow the community rule to the letter, as it were, what exactly does that mean in light of certain comments within the community rule that talk about, let's see here, I'll see if I can find an example. I might not be able to find it right away, but there's places that say things like, they shall walk according to all the precepts of God and the rule of the time. Something like that. That's, I think, in what we've already gone through, actually. In
I remember
column 3, I think it mentions that. So there are different things like that that have to be examined as to what exactly does that mean, according to the rule of the time and this and that. And then plus, we have still to ask questions and to really answer the questions, okay, is 1QS columns 1 to 5, that being the end of column 4, are the first 4 columns originally a separate document and to be tested separately? And then columns, let's say, 5, 6, and 7, a separate document, and then 8, something separate, because some of these manuscripts, some manuscripts of, quote-unquote, the community rule, begin in what is column 5 of 1QS. So why is that? Is it that 1QS represents the original form, and then things were broken up into separate, smaller documents, but they were originally part of one big document, in which case you'd have to investigate them all as a whole? Or is it that 1QS, the document that we are studying, is a compilation of several originally independent documents? And if that's the case, and if those originally independent documents originated from different people, then it's possible that, let's say, the first 4 columns could be a document that is a product of inspiration, and then the next 3 columns be a separate document which is not a product of inspiration, and then the next column be a document which is a product of inspiration. It could be something like that if we find that these were originally independent documents written by different authors. And so it's, in a sense, getting ahead of where we are to actually be able to answer questions like that. It's reasonable to ask and to wonder, okay, well, what's, because we all want to know where exactly are we going with this? What is the answer? What's the end game? That sort of thing. But the thing is, we're still in the process of investigation. We're still in the journey of it. And we don't know yet what the end game is going to be because we haven't actually studied out the necessary elements to know what it will be. What we can say so far is, well, man, we're reading this document, the community rule, and we're looking at this very well-preserved copy of it, 1QS, and we are partway through the 4th column, and everything so far is not only shown to be true and promoting righteousness, but it is actually declaring heaven-sent principles in a strikingly clear and profound way. And like, to give you an example, this whole section on the two spirits, I read it to a friend of mine the other night who isn't, like a part of this movement or anything like that, isn't necessarily even actively studying Scripture. And I just read this section, and it was amazingly profound to this individual. And it should be. I mean, anyone reading this should be like, wow, this is really profound. This is really something. It's making a statement, and it really puts things in perspective. It shows things as they really are. And people who aren't even necessarily at the present time devoting their lives to a religious purpose can see that because of just how strikingly it portrays the reality of truth versus falsehood. And so, we'll keep this in mind as we're studying. When we get to the beginning of column 5, in our studies, things will change to some extent. We'll have to start asking some different questions and, trying to find out, are the first 4 columns originally a separate document by a separate author, or is this all one united whole? And that's going to be a very important thing to determine, because that sort of thing is what determines exactly what we are testing. So, as much of a non-answer as that is, does that kind of help to put things in perspective, Anna?
Yes, very interesting answer. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Toda Elohini. Any other questions or comments?
I got a question.
Sure.
Does it say in the document anywhere what their purpose in living in a community like that was? Like we're supposedly living at the end of time, ready for the gospel to go to all the world. What advantage how would it help us to be more ready, say, to live in a community? What would we gain from it? Or why were they living in a community back then?
Okay, so, and there's something I want to specify, again, and I think it's very important to keep this in mind. When we're talking about a community as in the community rule, it's talking about a group of people united by the teachings of the teacher of righteousness. It's not talking about people living in a certain location. So the community of the community rule is like the association of Davidian Seventh-day Adventists or Branch Davidian Seventh-day Adventists. It's people that are spread out over a certain area that are united by their belief in a certain message and by the fact that they have in some way devoted their lives to living out that message and living out those teachings. So that's the first thing that I really think is important to keep in mind. Go ahead, Teresa.
How would that work in enforcing judicial laws, such as if, treating that Qumran community and the people who shared their beliefs that didn't live there, how would you say that they were able to enforce judicial laws such as food rations outside of the location?
Right. Well, that wouldn't really be a difficult thing, just like anyone having any judicial law without being in a small certain location can be enforced, especially if it's a community where everyone has agreed that they're going to live by these laws. So, like, you could say, oh, well, there's certain practices that are, and even the term enforce isn't the best term for this, but there are certain practices which all Seventh-day Adventists are supposed to do, supposed to keep, and there are certain things that are to be addressed. Like, let's say if someone violates certain principles, there are actions that leaders are supposed to take in seeking them and trying to address things with them, and then, like a Matthew 18 process, and, there's all these things that are supposed to be done with that, and there's communal meals, and there's all these things, but it's not restricted to one location. That can be done anywhere. And each person in their location, or at least for however many people, will have kind of a local community. They might have a few families that are, they're with them in their present location.
And that was my point of in situations where there isn't more than one or two people. If there isn't more than one family or household, there wouldn't be really any distribution of food by, anyone other than themselves.
Right. And
so it would just be, I guess, them abiding by the judicial laws set forth in the rule. It's of their own free will.
As it would be in a community, just the same, yeah.
Well, I understand that to a point, but I'm just trying to picture, when Leroy brought up that question, and I've always understood it to be that it's not just that location, but then his question connected with kind of Anna's question. I guess the two together sparked the thought, oh, well, wait a minute. Well, how then would this really be done spread out? Because, like, it's easy for me to see here at the Living Branch Center, the food is all purchased and it's all, distributed and shared, and, you know what I mean? Like, it's not everybody buying their own food, and so it's easier for me to picture, like, if it needed to be done here, that's just for my brain, it was more straightforward. But I do understand that if, let's say, in the times of the Qumran community, and there's people, because I'm using that because that's what's actually laid out here, and so I'm applying it to the people who are actually using this document and following these.
And to be clear, when you say Qumran community right now, are you referring to the people who lived at Qumran?
No, everyone that followed the 1QS.
To be clear, well, let's use the phrase Qumran community to refer to the people who lived at Qumran.
Okay.
And then we can use other phrases like the Yahad, which is, Serek HaYahad, rule of the community. The Yahad, the association, the community, the group as a whole, is broader than that, broader than just the Qumran community. The Qumran community is a sub-community within the Essene movement or the Teacher of Righteousness movement or whatever. There's not necessarily the clearest name, other than maybe the Yahad is the clearest name for it, since that's the term that's used in the scrolls to refer to the community at large, regardless of location.
Let's say someone lived all by themselves. They're the only member of their household, and they lived 100 miles from anyone else who shared their belief in the Jihad, the community or the united people. I guess if they found themselves to have violated principles of truth, that if they're genuinely repentant of violating the principles of truth, that they would just choose to deny themselves on their own, like without anyone around to say this needs to be done or anything like that. They would just do it.
Well, I'll give you an example. John the Baptist. He evidently either left the community or was kicked out of the community, and he had made certain vows, and because of those vows, he was restricting his appetite. He was doing different things that separated him from not only Gentiles, but even his fellow Jews. And when he was no longer part of the Qumran, or the, I say Qumran because he was right beside it, and it's very likely that he was actually associated with the Qumran community itself. When he was no longer a part of that community, whether it was specifically the Qumran community or the broader movement, he basically, in order to keep strict to his vows, he wasn't wearing garments other people gave him. He wasn't eating food other people gave him. He was just making it on his own. There was no one that was enforcing anything on him. He was just following those principles because of vows that he had made. And that's what he was doing because he was faithful. And so, but there's more that I want to say in answer to your question, Leroy. But with these other elements about how exactly this would apply to individuals or people not living in one location, someone in reading the community rule might think, that's some sort of dilemma or something like that. But really, that question applies just as equally to many other groups, including the early Nazarene movement, because we read about the Nazarene movement and how everyone had, communal meals was a part of it, breaking bread, drinking wine. There was things that they did together. There were rules for how they operated within the community, how they dealt with problems. And guess what? A lot of it is the same. Like they, just like in the community rule, among the early followers of Christ, after the resurrection, as described in Acts, described in the Didache, described in Paul's letters and elsewhere, they really believed that they were not to consider anything their own, just like it says in the community rule. They had a daily distribution of food. It's really an unreasonable thing for us. I know when I first read that, I think that was one of the elements that I was like, that sounds like rations or whatever. And if you use the word rations, sure, it sounds like, it's like joining the military or something harsh like that. But it's not necessarily harsh. It's not necessarily, just because there's a daily distribution of food, why would that be a bad thing? Like if you live in any setup where you have multiple people, that's basically going to end up being the case. Unless people are just so extremely wealthy that anyone can eat just anything they want. But in any situation where people are not rich, you have to figure out a way to have, enough food for people to eat and be healthy and everything, and that you can distribute and have everyone cared for and have enough for everyone else without just one or two people eating a whole lot and other people not having enough and stuff like that. So it's just fair and normal, like what you'd have to do.
Well, I'm just realizing also that for some reason, it is automatically, for me at least, something that carries a negative connotation to think of a daily distribution of food, as in rations, restriction, that sort of thing. But as I started thinking about it and questioning, why would I automatically think that? And I just came to realize, wait a minute. Do you know how many millions of people on this planet would be so grateful to know that their daily needs were met? That they don't have food, they would love to be in a community where there was daily distribution of food every day, guaranteeing that their needs are met.
Absolutely. That was the whole thing in Acts.
Yeah.
With, hey, not to forget the distribution. And it's like, okay, the apostles couldn't keep up with it. And some people weren't able to get, their distribution because there's just too many people to care for them. They're like, okay, we can't have this happen. So appoint for yourselves 7 individuals, and they'll take care of this. And so that's what they did. They appointed people so that they would make sure that everyone gets their distribution of food and all of that, and it's all good. It's not anything, it's actually to not get a daily distribution would be the bad part, but the system itself is good.
Yeah, and then just the last thing that comes to my mind in relation to this, at least I think it's the last thing, is I'm recognizing that, the other problem I was kind of having with this whole idea of daily distribution of food and 1/4 less food, as a restriction or a penalty or whatever, I was kind of picturing that as like, definitely like almost like a negative thing, even though I wouldn't have stated it necessarily. I knew there was some kind of rationale to it, and it makes sense that there has to be some kind of penalty for things, but then it just seemed like almost like an oppressive thing. But then it occurred to me, well, wait a minute. Nobody's forcing them to be there, part of the community. They're free, completely free to come and go.
Yeah, and they had visitors all the time, and people were able to come and just spend time with them there and whatever, too.
Well, yeah, but I mean, like, literally come and join, like, to join to the community, and they were completely free to leave, too.
Yeah.
If they didn't like the rules, I guess, if they didn't like the judicial laws, nobody was forcing them to stay there and to live by that. They were welcome to be there, and it's like, you're welcome to be here. Or be a part of the community, wherever here is, And it's just like with heaven. We want you in heaven, God would say, we want you in heaven, but here's how things have to operate for the benefit of everyone. And if you're not going to do that, you can't be here. That's one way of looking at it. And then it's also like, hey, if you don't like it, no one's forcing you to be here.
So I'm not wanting to go on this aspect too much longer, just because I want to answer Leroy's question, but there's more that I have to say in regard to that. But I do want to mention, since this element has been brought up, that there's another thing that I think people might just wrongly assume when they read about a daily distribution of food or something like that, is that it's like, just like, the whole like meat and potatoes type thing, like, just a couple items, and it's just like, whether it's like the imagery is prison food or something that's just like really bland and really simple and the same thing every day and different things like that, and a small amount, and then having a fourth of that gone is like barely able to sustain them or something like that. That doesn't seem at all to have been the case in the Qumran community. They had fruit trees there, they had an orchard, they had fig trees, they had all these different things. Like some people, and I don't think that this is correct, but some people have interpreted the Qumran settlement, some archaeologists have interpreted it to be a resort. Because it was nice. Like, they kept it up nice. They had an orchard. They had, like, all these things where it's obvious that they were eating good food and stuff, but it clearly wasn't a resort. It was a religious community. But they were well enough off that people ate well. People, like, it wasn't any sort of negative thing. And people who visited, like, all the reports that we have from outsiders, as it were, whether Josephus or Philo or Pliny, are all positive. And it was like going there and everything was an extremely positive experience that people enjoyed. So those are all different elements. But in order to answer your question, Leroy, that whole thing, I was just wanting to have a quick qualification as to when we talk about the community rule, we're not talking exclusively about the people who lived at Qumran. So the community rule is about the movement of people, regardless of location, who believed in the teachings of the teacher of righteousness. There was a portion of those people, some people estimate that there were maybe like 200 people there, something like that, who were there on a semi-regular basis at least. Maybe like 200 people upkeeping the place, running it, and all of that. But there were thousands. I think there were 4,000 people who were part of the movement in the land of Judea that Josephus mentioned. So the majority of them were living in the countryside and in different places scattered about among fellow Jews and all of that. I mean, in a sense, they weren't part of the cities or anything, so they were a bit separate. They were experiencing country living, as it were, but they weren't all, congregated into one location. But all of that is a qualification. The community rule does talk about going out into the wilderness for a particular purpose, which is your question, is there a purpose for them doing what they were doing and that sort of thing. But again, this applies not just to the people at Qumran, it applies to others who were also living outside of the cities in various areas and so on and so forth. And it's in column 8 of 1QS where it describes this. And it's actually, the way that it talks about it is not exactly a description of what people were doing, but this is talking about what people should do. So John the Baptist, for example, probably took this as his commission, and perhaps the Qumran community took this as their commission, and it's possible that the community rule was written even before the Qumran community existed. As in, we even have to find out, did the Qumran settlement, that place on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, was that even established while the teacher of righteousness was still alive and doing his thing? Or was that established afterward? It may be that it was established afterward, and there was no Qumran community in the days of the teacher of righteousness, and perhaps the community rule is from a pre-Qumran period, as in before that settlement was established, but still within the early stages of the movement started by the teacher of righteousness. So, that said, this is what this section says. This is from line 14 or so of column 8 of 1QS. And when these become members in the community of Israel, and when it's talking about these, it's talking about this group of 12 and 3. When these become members of the community of Israel according to all these rules, they shall separate from the habitation of unjust men and shall go into the wilderness to prepare there the way of him, as it is written, prepare in the wilderness the way of ... make straight in the desert a path for our God. Okay, and then it goes on. So the Qumran community, if this was written before the establishment of the community at Qumran, they may have been attempting to fulfill this. John the Baptist may have been attempting to fulfill this, and it sure sounds like he was when you consider the things that he said and he taught and his self-identity. So anyway, this is basically the purpose that those had who did go into the wilderness, but that's not equivalent to the community at large. So I hope that answers your question, Leroy. I heard you say that you have another question as well. You there? If you're there, Leroy, we cannot hear you. So maybe he got bumped off or something, or...
Yeah, no, everyone else can hear us, right?
I can.
Okay, good.
Okay, well, does anyone else have any questions or comments on these more broadly related issues?
I'll just make a short comment. Of course, I haven't made any final decisions. We're still studying this, as was discussed earlier, but I'm really glad to hear that, because as far as I knew at first, when I first read this, I thought it was just all probably written at once, and it, well, I'm just going to say it. There was parts of it towards the last that it just almost made me mad. It's like, I don't like this. That does not sound right. And some of the things have already been addressed, and I understand them now, and I see parallels with other things in the Bible, and they don't seem harsh to me at all now. But there are still things that do. And I'm glad that we can, be open-minded and study them out and find out if that's really the way it was or should be or whatever, because it just didn't make me feel really good reading part of that. And yet everything we've studied so far, I really like. And so I just wanted to say that. I mean, it's, if the person just reads it all and it's like, man, that really, did I just read that, And some things just need to be understood better. So I'm really looking forward to finding out more truth as we go along. And, I've just held that inside all this time, and I just wanted to get it off my chest. So
I'm back too. Something happened where my phone fell out.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm glad you're back, Leroy, and we want to get to your other question. But before that, I just want to reply to what Lynn just said as well. Reading the community rule, I mean, I've mentioned several times, in my first reading of it, there were things that I just didn't like about it. Or at least, I felt like not liking it. But I recognized that wasn't the right approach. Because I realized, well, I didn't really know. I hadn't really tested it. I hadn't really studied it. It's just an initial impression. But I would have just as much justification to have that initial impression of other things, which I already had accepted, but I didn't view them negatively because I was just used to them or whatever it may be. And so, one thing that I've come to realize is that while investigating something like this, it is important to be dispassionate about it, in the sense that we need to not allow the initial impressions and how we might emotionally respond to it influence the conclusions which we will draw. And one of the principles too in relation to this is that, and this is a good guiding principle that I've recently come to formulate clearly in my mind, because we've talked about being passionate about things and that sort of thing, and how there's certainly times and places where not only is that good, but where it would be wrong not to be passionate. But this is a distinction that is important for everyone to keep in mind, that where it is good to become passionate about something is concerning things of which we have obtained understanding. and the understanding produces a passion about it. But if we have a passion that arises as a result of a lack of understanding of something or concerning something which we have a lack of understanding of, then that passion is not the passion that is brought about by the inspiration of the Spirit of God through an understanding and knowledge of the truth. And so that passion can mislead us to come to false conclusions because it's not rooted in understanding. And so I just want to mention that for everyone as we are investigating the community rule. If you read something and you either like it or don't like it, and I'm using passion in a broad sense, it may be you feel angry about it or you have some sort of negativity toward it, or it may even just be a positive thing. Regardless of what it is, you should disassociate yourself from allowing the various emotions or feelings which you might feel to influence your conclusions, and even to, like, here's the thing, it's kind of hard to say, well, I'm going to just feel this strongly anyway, but I'm not going to allow it to influence my conclusions. It doesn't really work like that, because if we allow ourselves to strongly feel a certain way or whatever, again, whether positive or negative, it will influence our conclusions. So we have to say, okay, let me set that aside because I don't know yet, and investigate it. And then as I come to know, then I will either become passionately zealous for the teachings of this text because of understanding it, or I will be zealously opposed to it, or whatever it may be, whatever the truth calls for. But I think that that's very important as we study this and study everything else. But I know that we need to approach all things with a very level head, and the only way is if we are going to conduct straightforward and unbiased experiments.
Well, that's exactly what I had to do. I just said, wait a minute, I'm not going there right off the bat. I mean, that was my initial reaction, and I knew it was. And but we've learned better than that. We've learned not to do that, and I just had to, going along slowly like we're doing. As long as something is going along with heaven's principles, we can't fault it. And so, knowing what we know because we've really proved it is the only way to do it. And so it'll be interesting to take it to its conclusion. I just wanted to bring that up because I'll bet I'm not the only person that felt that way the first time they read it. And, we've got a long ways to go, and there's a lot of looking into it that we need to do. So I'm ready to keep studying it.
Amen.
Amen. So now I'm thinking we could have that other question that you had, Leroy, and then I'd like to focus in onto Rachel Nye's question just so that we can be sure to go through it since she had asked before the meeting. So what's your other question, Leroy?
I got a couple comments and then a question. That when a group works together, puts all their energies together on working as one, it's amazing what they can do. So you could have a beautiful community if everybody is working towards that. So that was my first comment. And then the second one, we're really already in a community then, if that's the way it is. We're agreeing we want to live by and Sister Wisdom or the Heavenly Family are the ones that we're not related to other men so much, but we want to be faithful to Sister Wisdom. And the last thing was kind of a question, maybe just another comment, but that maybe it's preparing us for when the kingdom we are the kingdom in the wilderness, but when it starts being set up over there in Israel, restored, maybe it's so there's going to be a lot of people coming in there. Maybe we're getting prepared to keep the order when that happens by this communal system. I think that's the end of my comments.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I'd agree. We're in preparation for the establishment of the kingdom in the land, and yes, this is already a community. It's we're part of the branch community, and the branch community started back in 1955, but even that was just a new name being added to a community which had already begun even earlier. And the Davidian movement is a Davidian community, so to speak. So it's the term can be used in different contexts in different ways.
Even goes back to the Millerite collapse and the beginning of the Seventh Adventist movement.
Yeah, you could say it goes back all the way to the very beginning.
Amen.
Okay, so we have about 20 more minutes left. So I want to look at Rachel's question here. Okay, so the question that she asked is, can I say the definition of the cleanness or purity is the degree or level of ability to understand, accept, follow the suitability of the sacred work based on their experiential knowledge? Okay, so of course this relates to what we were talking about in last night's meeting in relation to ritual purity and cleanness. It's the last attribute that we read is ways of lewdness in the service of uncleanness. And I've asked how you guys understand uncleanness, and we ended up talking about ritual purity. And so how do we understand ritual purity? So Rachel's question, from what I understand, is asking if purity or cleanness is really the degree or level of someone's ability to understand, accept, follow, etcetera, the sacred work that our Heavenly Family has given us. And that, I would say, is actually a very good way to explain it. Ritual purity, so, you could use the term in a few different ways, I suppose, but if you're talking about someone's purity condition, someone's condition of purity or someone's level of purity, then it is talking about the degree or level of their ability to accept and follow the truth, hopefully based on their experiential knowledge, although it may not be based on any experiential knowledge or any genuine knowledge at all, which all genuine knowledge is experiential. It may not be based on experiential knowledge, depending on which purity zone they're in. If they are not in holiness, and let's say they are in the outskirts of purity, then they may not have any genuine knowledge. It may just be belief, but they still can, in an outward form at least, keep certain precepts of truth and are thus not having such a high degree of impurity that they're outside the camp, as it were. But ideally, we ought to have our ability to accept and follow the truth and do the sacred work of our Heavenly Family being based on experiential knowledge. And if it is based on experiential knowledge and we are actually really following the truth and living a just life, in addition to just being fit to know certain things and be given certain responsibilities, then that is moving beyond just having purity, and it is living a life of holiness, in a sense.
Quick comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
It could be the level of our usefulness, too. How well God can use us to finish the work. In
a sense, that can be said to be the case, but it has to be specified to refer to usefulness to do the holy work, because someone may be useful to do another work, and that work may be just as important and just as good. So it's not just someone's inherent usefulness, and that's it. Because you could have, let's just look at the type, let's say. You could have people in all these different purity zones, and let's say you have people who are priests, and they are in a certain purity zone, they're in holiness, and they're in the sanctuary, and they are useful to do that work. And then you could have someone else who is not a priest, and let's say they're pure, they're clean, but they're not fit to go where the priests are fit to go. They aren't fit to go into the holy place, and they aren't fit to be in the sanctuary just hanging out there doing rituals or anything, but they can come there to offer sacrifice. They may not be useful to do the work of the priests, but they may be useful to be a farmer or to do whatever else, let's say. So let's just say they have a field, and maybe they even produce the grain from which the wave sheaf is taken, or whatever it may be, So they have their part to play, and they're useful for that part, even though they do not have a level within the purity system which brings them as close to the most holy place as the priests. But that's
they're part
okay.
of the
It's
body.
not saying
They're part
exactly,
of the
they're
body.
part of the body. So it's not to say that they are inherently not useful or just kind of, or something like that. It's just that their use is for something different than the work which is very close to the heavenly family.
Amen.
So hopefully that answers your question, Rachel.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, well, we've been on for almost an hour and 20 minutes now, and so I think we should wrap it up within these next 10 minutes or so. So if anyone else has any other quick comments or questions that won't end up going to something that we won't be able to finish within this next 10 minutes, then feel free to mention that. Of course, focusing on things related to the subject that we're looking at.
Did we lose them?
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, I guess so.
Did you? I guess you guys didn't hear him say, if there's any quick comments, feel free,
Yep.
and if not, would somebody please pray? You didn't hear that?
Oh, no, not would somebody please pray. No, I did not hear that. And I can close if you'd like. Dear Heavenly
Sure,
Family,
that
we
sounds
just
great.
thank you. Yes, we thank you, Heavenly Family, for all that you do for us each and every day, and we pray that you'll be with all the branches and our friends and families who are suffering in any way at this time, experiencing loneliness or health problems, financial burdens. And we just pray that everyone will remember to take our burdens to the Lord and just leave them there. And we thank you so much for the opportunity to learn. We're very blessed to have this message, and so we just pray that you will open our minds and our hearts to accept it. And we ask all these things in the name of the branch.
Amen.
Amen.